Are members of the Coast Guard eligible for VA disability benefits?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Any full-time military person, including those in the Coast Guard, despite the reassignment of that entity to the Department of Homeland Security, is in fact eligible for VA benefits.
And does that apply to the recently minted Space Force as well?
Even the Space Force, folks. Yep.
I haven't handled any Space Force cases myself. I don't think they've been around long enough.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Tony Francis Jackson.
Hello, welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for VA disability benefits, subscribe for all the information about VA disability. So welcome to today's podcast. Who are we? Well, I'm Francis Jackson, this is Kristian Terison, and we're from Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in getting justice for veterans on their claims for VA benefits. And what's this about? Well, today we're going to talk about who actually qualifies as a veteran and how that impacts claims for folks in the National Guard or reserves, for example. So who's this show is for? Well, this show is obviously for veterans, but it's broader than that. It's about who cares about veterans, folks who are relatives, friends, or just community support for veterans are all the folks that this show is designed to help. This podcast is just our way of getting information out into the community about what the rules and regulations and procedures are for getting VA disability benefits. So without further ado.
All right. Well, to start with, I think we can dispatch pretty quickly at least one commonly asked question, and that is, are members of the Coast Guard eligible for VA disability benefits?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Any full-time military person, including those in the Coast Guard, despite the reassignment of that entity to the Department of Homeland Security, is in fact eligible for VA benefits.
And does that apply to the recently minted Space Force as well?
Even the Space Force, folks.
Okay.
Yep.
I haven't handled any Space Force cases myself. I don't think they've been around long enough.
I'm not sure anybody's completed a term of enlistment yet
To make it
in
to
the
our
Space
desks.
Force.
Right.
Right.
So more complex are the National Guard and the reserves. So can you, I guess, clarify the eligibility criteria for those groups when it comes to VA disability?
Sure. The way it works essentially is you have to be a veteran on active duty in order to be eligible for a whole series of presumptions that apply to veteran status and so on. And there's an early case from the court, the Biggins case, that talks about who this covers and who it doesn't. And essentially what it comes down to is you have to be on active duty. There are some exceptions to that. If you're in the reserves or the Guard and you are called up for a period of active duty, then obviously you qualify for any injury or illness stemming from that period of active duty. But you can also get benefits for periods where you were on what's called inactive duty for training. Typically for reserves and Guard, that would be weekend drills or the 2-week period of service each year. If you can show that some injury or illness or other event occurred during a period of inactive duty for training, then you are still potentially eligible for that claim, as long as you could meet the other requirements for showing service connection and entitlement to benefits. But it gets a little complicated because if Guard or reserves folks are mobilized, it only counts if they're mobilized federally. So, for example, there are some really sad cases from a few years ago. The Oklahoma National Guard was called up by the governor of Oklahoma when there was a riot at the state prison in Oklahoma, and the Guard was called in essentially to retake the prison from the prisoners who had taken it over. And not surprisingly, several guardsmen were quite seriously injured. And they applied for benefits, and the VA said, sorry, but you're not eligible because this was not federal service. You don't get federal benefits from the federal Department of Veterans Affairs if you were called up by the state. And that's what happened there. So there's a very clear distinction, particularly for National Guard units, between whether they're called up by state or federal. If it's federal, then it's the eligibility for benefits will be present. But if it's a call up for state service, then not.
Okay. Now, is all training considered federal for disability benefits purposes, or can there be a situation?
Ordinarily.
Okay. Well, you say ordinarily. There may be exceptions out there where there's a specific...
It is theoretically possible for some governor somewhere to call up the Guard in his state for some special training unrelated to federal service, but it would be extremely unusual and quite unlikely.
Okay. Now, I know that for more typical military service, if you're injured on the way to a training, you can still get disability benefits for that injury. Is that still the case for guardsmen and reservists?
Yes, it is. As long as you can prove that you were en route to or from your training, then typically you'll be covered. Sometimes you see these cases where the person simply is not able to demonstrate that they were returning from Guard at the time of this injury or accident. But those are very fact-specific kinds of things. But yes, if you can show that you had orders to report to a particular base at 8:45 on the morning of October 30th, and it was 6:30 and you were en route and you were in this accident, then yes, you would be covered.
And is there any difference when it comes to establishing service connection for a disability that meets those requirements for the active duty window?
No. The same three elements always apply. You have to show something that happened in service, you have to show a current medical problem, and you have to show a medical opinion linking those two, explaining that what happened in service is the underlying cause or is related to the current medical problem.
Okay.
But you just have this extra level of showing that you were involved in active duty for training at the time of those underlying events. So, for example, we have a fellow who was in the reserves for years and at various times encountered various medical problems. For example, he was exposed to Agent Orange at a couple places in the U.S., including Fort Holabird. There was another one as well in his case. Might have been Fort Drum, but I don't remember for sure. But there was exposure to Agent Orange, and there was also, he collapsed during a period for training, and turned out he had diabetes. No, who knew? But we were able to get his diabetes service connected because it occurred, obviously, while he was on inactive duty for training.
And I wanted to ask, diabetes is one of those types of conditions that, if it hadn't been diagnosed prior to that, it's a pretty, easy sell to say, oh, he collapsed as a severe symptom of diabetes, diagnosed thereafter. But, what about, I'm thinking particularly of psychiatric conditions where it can be really difficult to nail down a date for an onset.
Yeah, those are harder. We have had some success with getting service connection for mental health issues for reservists, but essentially you have to show that the symptoms were present during a period of training. And we had one young woman who was called up. Her unit was involved in logistics. They were called up to load ships for the Persian Gulf operation. And we were able to demonstrate that during the period she was called up for duty, it was like a month, she was demonstrating significant symptoms, and we were able to show that. And in another case, we had one where the gentleman had to be told not to come to a period of training because of active mental health symptoms. And in that same gentleman's case, he was at the armory where his unit was stationed and had a set of verbal altercations with non-commissioned officers and officers where he was clearly displaying severe mental health symptoms. And we were ultimately able to persuade the board that his mental health condition should be connected to his service. But those are very problematic cases and really very fact-dependent.
And earlier you had mentioned, using documentation showing, your orders to establish that a particular event or injury happened in that active duty window. Are there other types of evidence or documentation that are particularly important when it comes to reserves or National Guard and making a disability claim?
Well, all the typical records maintained by the unit showing who's where and why and what they're doing can be critically important. It's an issue of sort of wading through the available records and figuring out which ones have the information that bears on the particular claim. But you're always going to need some kind of documentation establishing that the person was an active member of the unit and was on some kind of duty. We've had one where the fellow was on the shooting team, marksmanship team for this particular unit, and was assigned as part of his unit activities to go to this civilian competition and shoot as part of their team, and was injured while he was there. But you have to have some official record showing that the person was in fact on duty at the time, either for training, inactive duty for training, or active duty, in order to establish eligibility.
Gotcha. And I know we recently did a whole episode on the VA's duty to assist when it comes to disability claims. Is there any difference in that duty when it comes to Guard members or reservists, or I guess any other role that the VA takes on when it comes to folks who served in the reserves or National Guard?
Not once you get over the hurdle of showing that they were, on duty for training. For example, we had a fellow who was on duty for training and had an injury to his knee as incidental to, they were repairing a truck, and a jack collapsed or something, and it came down and damaged his knee. But as long as you can show that you have an injury or an illness that you can establish was occurring at a time when they were on either inactive duty for training or active duty, then the same duty to assist rules apply as any other.
And what are some, I guess, common misconceptions that you've encountered about disability benefits when it comes to National Guard and reserves?
Well, I think the biggest one is that you should be entitled to benefits for conditions that occurred during your period of Guard or Reserve service that can't be shown to have specifically been present during a period of either active duty or active duty for inactive duty for training. So, for example, if you have somebody who's on active duty and they develop a heart condition, it's going to be presumed that that's connected to service because they had those symptoms during their period of active duty service. But if you have someone who's a reservist, there's no such presumption. There's a special provision actually for Guard and Reserves, where if you have a stroke or heart attack, those conditions will be covered. But, if you simply develop a condition, for example, a case where, I'm trying to remember what it was he developed, perhaps MS. I guess it was MS that he developed. But we were unable to show that his symptoms developed during his period of active duty, as opposed to simply emerging over the time that he was in the Guard. And to this point, we've not been able to get him benefits. I am hopeful that will change, but we've had no success to this point.
I know that our audience for this podcast is primarily veterans, but what steps should a National Guard or Reserve member take if they're injured or become ill during service? What should their first steps be?
It's very important that they make sure that their unit makes a record of that. If you collapse in the field and are rushed to a civilian hospital nearby, you want to make darn sure that there's a record in your unit records showing that, service member Jones collapsed and had to be rushed to a nearby civilian hospital. Because if there is no record, the VA will not accept that claim. You'll be in for a fight, one you may not win.
What would you say are the most significant barriers facing National Guard or Reserve members when it comes to accessing VA disability benefits?
Lousy records. I can't tell you how bad some of the Guard and Reserve units are about keeping records. These are folks who are not full-time service members. They're called up from whatever civilian occupation, and they don't necessarily keep very good records. Sometimes they barely maintain the absolute minimum. Sometimes they even fall short of that. But it is a recurring problem getting records showing that Guard and Reserve members were present for training at a particular point in time when they developed whatever medical problem it was. It's a recurring problem. Half the time they can't find the unit records at all from years ago, and other times when you get the unit records, they're so skimpy that you can't show anything from them. It's a recurring problem.
And related to that, I guess, what are some strategies for overcoming the poor record-keeping problem? I know that we can look for contemporaneous, like media reports, if there's a big incident. I don't know what other options.
Well, the other option really is statements, what the VA sometimes refers to as buddy statements, but basically statements by people who were present and typically other members of the unit and know what occurred. Those are usually about the only way to solve the lack of record problem. Although, as you point out, sometimes if there are particularly bad things that happen, it makes the local press.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about, I know that, as you were saying, this gets very fact-intensive and case-specific, yeah. But, a person who can show their orders to be somewhere at a particular time and place, and then, a medical record from the emergency room that's, same date, 3 hours later.
Yeah,
is that enough to make it?
Usually that'll work. The VA sometimes just seems to have cases where they are willfully obtuse about connecting the dots, but generally speaking, a set of facts like the one you just outlined will work.
Okay. So really, at the end of the day, it's, if you're looking at a claim years down the road and it's, too late to make sure that you're listed as having gone to the hospital, it really gather everything that's available to you, showing the details of where you were, why, because, even if it's just circumstantial, that could be enough to prevail.
Absolutely.
All right. And did you have any parting advice for National Guard members or reservists who might be considering applying for disability benefits?
Well, not if they're at the point of considering applying for benefits. I would encourage people who are in the Guard or Reserves to make sure that any incidents or accidents or, health issues that occur while on duty for training, inactive duty for training, are documented. That's the biggest single thing. But if they're at the point of applying, it's what you said earlier. It's a question of figuring out what are all the possible sources of information that apply to this event and collecting them up and knitting them together with statements and whatever else you need to support that this was an authorized period of at least inactive duty for training, and this is what happened and this is how it happened, and getting statements from everybody that you can find that was there, and generally tying it up with a bow as best you can.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. This has been another episode of Victory Over VA. Thank you for joining us. Please be sure to subscribe and tune in next week.
We hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.